اليوم راح أتناول another gland راح نسميها Adrenal Glands. ليش glands؟ لأنه there are two glands, one on each kidney, one on the above of each kidney. Adrenal glands هن paired glands consist of large outer region راح نسميه adrenal cortex and small narrow هذا اللون الوردي الطخ الغامق هنسميه adrenal medulla. الادرينال كورتكس الآن متكونة واقعا من 3 layers زونة، يعني قلنا layer outer layer يسموها glomerulosa، الانر layer نسميها fasciculata، والزونة reticularis. Each zone of these 3 zones produce a significant hormone وراح ناخذهن على التوالي. So zone glomerulosa review the target function of فقط mineralocorticoid. ليش mineralocorticoid؟ لأنه له علاقة وثيقة بالصوديوم retention و excretion of the potassium during the renal filtration. So zona glomerulosa produce a hormone called mineralocorticoid because they are affecting the salt balance مثل ما قلنا الصوديوم والبوتاسيوم. النموذج اللي عندنا هو للمينرالوكورتيكويد هرمون نسميه الدوستيرون وهذا ستيرويد طبعا is the most important. Among its function are sodium retention and potassium excretion by the kidney. Cells of the zona fasciculata and zona reticularis الوسط والأخيرة produce a family of hormones called glucocorticoids. هذه الهرمونز الجروب مالتها هي كورتيزول، كورتيزون وكورتيكوستيرون، لأنه هذني علاقة إلها relation with regulation of glucose metabolism، إلى علاقة بالجلوكوز ميتابوليزم، ولذلك سميناهن glucocorticoids. Only the cortisol is secreted in significant amount in the human beings. In addition طبعا لregulation of the energy اللي قلنا glucose metabolism هي الانرجي energy metabolism، الكورتيزول إلى علاقة وثيقة بالregulation of the immune system and facilitate the stress response. هذا هو الكورتيزول regulate the immune system، بس الكثرة من عنده تسوي له سترس. regulate the energy metabolism والجلوكوز يعني قريب وظيفيا من الانسولين، وبعدين facilitate the stress response. both cells zona reticularis, zona fasciculata and zona reticularis also produce the third family of the hormones. هاي الهرمونز مجموعة كبيرة راح نسميها androgens، وبطبيعة الحال الاندروجينز are male sex hormone that include مجموعات androstenedione and testosterone. لكن active secretion at the puberty in both sexes, male and female, the early growth spurt, appearance of axillary and pubic hair. Androgen رغم كونه male sex hormone are also responsible for the sex drive of the female مثل ما راح يشوفون الفيلم. القسم الأخير ما عندها هذا الكورتكس احنا تكلمناه هسه وقلنا 3 هرمونز بيها اللي عددناهن من الأعلى اللي سميناه الدوستيرون أول واحد، بعدين الكورتيزون جروب، وبعدين أخير واحد اللي ميل سكس درايف سميناه أندروجينز. الكورتكس الآن خلصناها ب 3 هرمونز. راح ناخذ الميدلا. Adrenal الميدلا is modified sympathetic ganglion. يعني إذن هي بالأصل sympathetic nervous system that produce a family of amino group called catecholamine. إذن الفوق كان كل الهرمونات ستيرويد، في حين بالمدلة هن أمين هرمونز. أمين هرمونز يعني أصلا هن أمين هرمونز. التو مين هرمونز اللي هو الإبنفرين والنور إبنفرين، هذا هن الإفرازات اللي تصير مال sympathetic ganglion اللي هي المدلة of the adrenal gland. إبنفرين بواقع 4 إلى 5 مرات أكثر متوفر من النور إبنفرين. هسه الكاتيكولامينز are important during the fight and the flight response. Fight and the flight response.
Consist of a large outer region called the adrenal cortex and a small central region called the adrenal medulla. The cortex secretes 3 families of steroid hormones: mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. Note that each is produced by a different group of cells. The medulla secretes amine hormones known as catecholamines. Click the zona glomerulosa to review targets and functions of the cells of the zona glomerulosa. Produce hormones called mineralocorticoids because they affect salt balance. Aldosterone is the most important. Among its functions are sodium retention and potassium excretion by the kidneys. Click the gray histology image to continue. Click the zona fasciculata, zona reticularis to review the targets and functions of the glucocorticoids and androgens. Cells of both zona fasciculata and zona reticularis produce a family of hormones called glucocorticoids because they regulate glucose metabolism. This family includes cortisol, cortisone, and corticosterone. Only cortisol is secreted in significant amounts in humans. We will study cortisol in detail in Topic 5. In addition to regulating energy metabolism, cortisol regulates the immune system and facilitates the stress response. Click cortisol to continue. Cells of both zona fasciculata and zona reticularis also produce a family of hormones called androgens. Androgens are male sex hormones that include androstenedione and testosterone. Active secretion at puberty in both sexes causes the early growth spurt and appearance of axillary and pubic hair. Androgens are also responsible for sex drive in females. Click the gray histology image to continue. Click the adrenal medulla to review targets and functions of the catecholamines. The adrenal medulla is a modified sympathetic ganglion that produces a family of amine hormones called catecholamines. The 2 main hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is 4 or 5 times more abundant than norepinephrine. We will study it in detail in Topic 5. The catecholamines are important during the fight or flight response when immediate physical action is called for. To study another
الآن راح نتناول أهم ما يتعلق بالكورتيزون وشنو وظيفته والسكريشن مالته وطريقة الأكشن مالته على الخلايا. أول شيء سنتسيز مالته مثل ما تشوفون.
Cortisol is synthesized from cholesterol in adrenal cortex cells. The cells do not store cortisol.
طيب. The function of the cortisol.
Cortisol is important in the body's response to stress. It is key among the many hormones involved in controlling metabolic fuels. It ensures an adequate supply of glucose and fatty acids during times of stress when a person has not eaten. It decreases glucose use in muscle and adipose tissue and spares glucose for the brain. In the absence of cortisol, a short fast can produce dangerously low plasma glucose levels and glycogen depletion from skeletal muscle and the liver. Cortisol acts on blood vessels to enhance the effects of sympathetic vasoconstriction. In the absence of cortisol, a moderate stress can produce hypotension. Cortisol has protective effects that are not well understood. Without an adequate rise in cortisol, a person can die from a severe stress. Death usually results from the failure of the circulatory system. Cortisol inhibits inflammation and depresses the immune response. Too great an inflammatory response can harm nearby healthy tissue, and too vigorous an immune response may cause harm potentially leading to autoimmunity. Cortisol acts to temper these important body defenses. This action of cortisol is exploited by the pharmaceutical industry for the treatment of rashes, asthma, other inflammations, and autoimmune diseases.
الآن نشوف على السيلولار ميكانيزم.
Cortisol enters cells by diffusion. Nearly every cell in the body has receptors for the glucocorticoids. Cortisol binds to receptors in cytosol and the nucleus that alter gene expression. In addition to intracellular receptors, there are plasma membrane receptors for cortisol. Rapid inhibition of CRH by the feedback loop is mediated through these plasma membrane receptors.
في حالة
One way
زيادة
that scientists learn about the endocrine system is to observe the symptoms of patients who secrete too much or too little of a particular hormone. Two relatively rare diseases of the adrenal gland help illustrate some of the functions of cortisol. Cushing's disease, or hypercortisolism, occurs when the body is exposed to high levels of cortisol for a prolonged period. Addison's disease, or primary adrenal insufficiency, occurs when the adrenal glands produce too little cortisol and too little aldosterone. Cushing's disease is caused by tumors of the pituitary that secrete increased amounts of ACTH. It is the most common cause of hypercortisolism. Hypercortisolism from all other causes, such as glucocorticoid drugs, is called Cushing's syndrome. The glucocorticoid prednisone may be prescribed for asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, other inflammatory diseases, or for immunosuppression following an organ transplant. Addison's disease is caused by damage to the adrenal cortex, inducing hyposecretion of both cortisol and aldosterone. Hyposecretion of cortisol from other causes, such as pituitary damage and subsequent lack of ACTH, produces similar symptoms. In this case, aldosterone secretion is normal. Cushing's patients experience paradoxical accumulation of fat that produces a round moon face and a buffalo hump on the back. A cardinal symptom of Addison's disease is a change in skin pigmentation that produces a bronzed color. Based on what you have learned about cortisol, answer the following questions. Click on the patient who will have the symptoms described. You must get the correct answer to proceed. Which patient has hypoglycemia? One function of cortisol is to promote production and release of glucose. Lack of cortisol results in low plasma glucose. Which patient may exhibit signs of steroid diabetes? Hyperglycemia in Cushing's patients can lead to diabetes mellitus. The chronic increase in insulin levels induced by hyperglycemia can cause pancreatic beta cells to fail. These high levels of insulin might also explain the redistribution of body fat. The action of insulin on normal body fat stores is antagonized by cortisol. In other body areas, like the face and upper back, insulin can promote lipogenesis. Which patient might get dizzy or faint due to low blood pressure? Cortisol promotes vasoconstriction. Insufficient amounts of cortisol can lead to dangerous low blood pressure. Both patients may feel fatigued and have muscle weakness, but which one will have increased nitrogen breakdown products in the blood and spindly arms and legs due to muscle loss? Cortisol promotes protein breakdown to supply amino acids to the liver, where they are used to produce glucose. Loss of protein also accounts for the easy bruising and poor wound healing seen in Cushing's patients. Which patient may be at risk for overwhelming infections? Cortisol inhibits the inflammatory response and depresses the immune system. The risk of infection rises in patients who are taking prednisone and those with hypersecretion of cortisol. Which patient may show decreased plasma levels of sodium and dehydration and therefore crave salty food? Loss of aldosterone accompanies the loss of cortisol in Addison's disease. Aldosterone acts to retain salt and water. Note that the loss of aldosterone contributes to the low blood pressure in Addison's patients. Both of these pathologies can be treated. Cushing's disease is treated by surgical removal of the tumor. When Cushing's syndrome is caused by therapeutic drugs such as prednisone, treatment involves adjusting the dosage of the drug. Addison's disease is treated by replacement of cortisol and aldosterone. Secondary adrenal insufficiency is treated by replacement of cortisol.
أعزائي الطلبة، اليوم راح نتناول الأوفريز. موضوع الأوفريز، طبعا الأوفريز in the female. وبالنسبة لنا طبعا هذا هو reproductive system of the female. يتكون من الأوفري، بعدين فالوبيان تيوب، بعدين اليوترس. فالآن الأوفريز نتناولها باعتبارها هي endocrine tissue. The ovaries produce the female sex hormone. من هم؟ They are induced steroid hormones طبعا اللي هم الاستروجين والبروجسترون، هذول steroid. And the other third one هو peptide hormone نسميه inhibin. The estrogen and inhibin are produced by the granulosa cell سنشوفها. Then by the corpus luteum. بس هذه نشوفها هنا. هذه هي ثيكا سيل، هذه جرانيولوزا، هذه اللي هي لونها أحمر، هاي موجود جرانيولوزا، هذه موجودة. أوكي. Just prior to the ovulation, small amount of progesterone are produced by the granulosa and theca cell اللي قلنا عليه granulosa and theca cell. The corpus luteum بعدين، الكوربس luteum يعني ما تبقى من بعد الأوفيوليشن. The corpus luteum is the major source of the progesterone. والبروجسترون تكون من كلمتين، هذا برو يعني قبل، جسترون يعني gestation يعني قبل الحمل. فإذا المفهوم أنه هذا ينفرز قبل الحمل. والقسم الأول الاستروجين اللي هو ينفرز بالنصف الأول من المنسترال سايكل. استروجين and progesterone together regulate the ovarian function. The cyclic changes in the uterine lining and the breast development during the puberty. الاستروجين بالذات promote development of the female gamete يعني الإج من كونها سيل وحدة إلى أن يصير قريب الأوفيوليشن. يعني إذا قسمنا the month، يعني month بالنسبة للفيميل 28 يوم، شهر قمري 28 يوم. النصف الأول يعني من day 1 إلى النصف 14 هذا يشتغل الهرمون اللي قلنا الاستروجين. استروجين مسؤول عن عملية تهيئة النصف الأول من عملية المنسترال سايكل. طبعا وجود الاستروجين مع الفوليكيولار ستيميوليتنج هرمون اللي ينفرز من الانتيرير بيتيتري جلاند، راح اثنين بوث يشتغلن بالنصف الأول من المنسترال سايكل. بالضبط بالدي 15 منتصف الدورة الشهرية راح يشتغل البروجسترون زائدا الهرمون لوتينايزنج هرمون. فشو يصير عملية الأوفيوليشن يعني البيضة تنزل من الأوفري إلى الفالوبيان تيوب وتنزل إلى اليوترس. البيضة بهالحالة هذه هي تحمل نصف العدد من الكروموسومات، وتنتظر إذا صارت عملية تلقيح للبيضة راح يصير بها زايغوت، راح تصير زايغوت تحمل ضعف العدد من الكروموسومات، يعني تحمل إما XX أو XY، يعني النصف الثاني من الميل يكمل لنا يسوي لنا زايغوت. فالبروجسترون مسؤول عن تهيئة اندومتريوم حتى يكون عملية جستيشن أو حمل. فالاستروجين promote the development قلنا of the gamete من النصف الأول، development of other secondary sex characters and maturation of the reproductive organs in the female. في حين البروجسترون is required for the مثل ما قلنا pregnancy، هي إن الاندومتريوم. inhibin يسوي لنا suppress للسكريشن of follicular stimulating hormone. في حالة لما تصير pregnancy ماكو داعي بعد أن ينزل لنا ال FSH حتى يهيئ لنا development of another egg، راح يتوقف بواسطة الانهبين إلى أن يصير عملية ولادة، يلا ترجع مرة ثانية نفس المنسترس سايكل. بالنسبة للتستس اللي مسؤولة عن إفراز ذي هرمون واحد، هو طبعا تستوستيرون المسؤول، هذا تستس produce the male sex hormone. They induce steroid testosterone وأيضا بها inhibin peptide inhibin. The testosterone in the male ولو فعلا أكو تستوستيرون بالفيميل لكن تستوستيرون بالميل أكثر. The testosterone is produced by the interstitial cell بالسيمنيفرس تيوبيول هاي قدامكم. And inhibin is produced in the sustentacular cell وذاك بالانترستيشيال cell. فإذا هنا ينفرز التستوستيرون والسستنتيكولار سيل الموجودة تفرز لنا الانهبين. هذول بوث اثنين هرمونز. تستوستيرون وظيفيا promote the development of the male gamete اللي هو السبيرم. هذا هو السبيرم موجود. طبعا السبيرم يتكون من هيد، وهاي النيك بها ميتوكوندريا تعتبر أضخم ميتوكوندريا بالكائن الحي. هذه تلف لنا النيك كلها لأنه يحتاج إلى مجهود في عملية الموفمنت حتى يوصل يسوي عملية fertilization to the ova. فإذا التستوستيرون مسؤول عن development of the gamete, maturation and maintenance of the male reproductive organs, development of the secondary sex characters اللي قلنا عليهن كاملة. طيب
They include the steroids estrogen and progesterone and the peptide hormone inhibin. Estrogen and inhibin are produced first by the granulosa cells, then by the corpus luteum. Just prior to ovulation, small amounts of progesterone are produced by the granulosa and theca cells. The corpus luteum is the major source of progesterone. Click the mature follicle to review the targets and functions of the ovarian hormones. Estrogen and progesterone together regulate ovarian function, cyclic changes in the uterine lining, and breast development during puberty. Estrogen promotes development of the female gamete, the egg, development of other secondary sex characteristics, and maturation of the reproductive organs in females. Progesterone is required for pregnancy. Inhibin suppresses secretion of FSH. To study another gland, click its name. Testes produce the male sex hormones. They include the steroid testosterone and the peptide inhibin. Testosterone is produced by the interstitial cells, and inhibin is produced by the sustentacular cells. Click the seminiferous tubule to review the targets and functions. Testosterone promotes development of the male gamete, the sperm, development, maturation, and maintenance of the male reproductive organs, development of the secondary sex characteristics, and sex drive. As in the female, inhibin suppresses secretion of FSH. To study
الآن أعزائي الطلبة راح نتناول كيفية انتقال الهرمونز وتأثيرها على السيل التارجت أورجان أو التارجت سيل. عندنا احنا قلنا 3 أنواع من الهرمونز، هي بيبتايد، وقسم الآخر إن ستيرويد وأمينو جروب، لكن قسمناهن نوعين ووتر سوليوبل هرمونز اللي تشمل لنا البيبتايد هرمون والكاتيكول أمينز. هذني bind to the plasma membrane، على plasma membrane، هاي خلية وهاي plasma membrane، وهذن ريسبتورز مختلفة لهرمونات مختلفة. في حين النوع الثاني اللي هي ليبيد سوليوبل، ما تبقى النصف الباقي من الأمينو جروب زائد الستيرويد تنتقل لنا عن طريق السيل وول of the nucleus of the DNA. هسه راح نشوفها شلون تنتقل water soluble hormones اللي قلنا البيبتايدز والكاتيكول امينز. هسه راح نشوف لكم اياها.
The water-soluble hormones, peptides, and catecholamines bind to plasma membrane receptors on the outside surface of the cell. There are several categories of plasma membrane receptors, including receptors that activate G proteins and receptors with protein kinase activity. We will examine the most common G protein mechanisms and the protein kinases called tyrosine kinases that phosphorylate tyrosine. We will look at each kind of receptor, beginning with the receptors that activate G proteins. In the inactivated state, guanosine diphosphate, GDP, is bound to the G protein. Drag the hormone to the binding site on the receptor to observe its action.
هذا هو الهرمون وهذا الريسبتر مالته ما يرهم غير عليه fit.
When a hormone binds to the receptor changes shape and activates the G protein. It releases GDP and binds guanosine triphosphate, GTP, a high-energy molecule. Part of the activated G protein travels along the membrane and activates an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase catalyzes the conversion of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, to cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Cyclic AMP is a second messenger. The hormone is the first messenger. Cyclic AMP activates the intracellular enzyme protein kinase A, which can phosphorylate many other proteins, activating some and inhibiting others. This mechanism can induce many different effects within a single cell and different actions in different cell types. This second messenger system can also phosphorylate ion channels and alter their activity. The response of the cell ends when cyclic AMP is degraded to AMP in a reaction catalyzed by the enzyme phosphodiesterase. While active, G proteins keep stoking the pathway to phosphorylation of cellular proteins so that huge numbers of them are produced. This phenomenon, called amplification, greatly increases the effect that a single molecule of a hormone can have on a cell. To view the animation again, drag the hormone to the receptor. Click Continue to proceed.
صار واضح إذن هذا هو الووتر سوليبل هرمونز اللي قلنا هنا نوعين، إما البيبتايد أو نوع آخر من الأمينو جروب أيضا ينتقل لنا عن طريق السيل ممبرين.
G proteins, like the one we just described, that stimulate production of cyclic AMP are known as stimulatory G proteins. Inhibitory G proteins inhibit production of cyclic AMP and the subsequent response of the cell. Another type of G protein activates an intracellular messenger system that uses diacylglycerol and inositol trisphosphate as second messengers. Drag the hormone to the binding site on the receptor to observe its activity. When a hormone binds to the receptor, The receptor changes shape and activates the G protein. It releases GDP and binds GTP, a high-energy molecule. Part of the activated G protein travels along the membrane and activates an enzyme called phospholipase C. Phospholipase C causes a membrane phospholipid called phosphatidylinositol bisphosphate to cleave into diacylglycerol and inositol trisphosphate. Each functions as a second messenger. Diacylglycerol remains in the membrane where it activates protein kinase C and inositol trisphosphate enters the cytosol. The activated protein kinase C phosphorylates other proteins, causing responses of the cell. Inositol trisphosphate prompts the endoplasmic reticulum to release calcium ions. Calcium ions also behave like second messengers. They can act directly on proteins or bind to the protein calmodulin that can act on proteins to cause the response of the cell. To view the animation again, drag the hormone to the receptor. Click Continue to proceed. Drag each hormone to a binding site on the receptor to observe its activity. When a hormone binds to a tyrosine kinase receptor, the receptor joins with a neighboring receptor and changes shape. Each receptor phosphorylates tyrosine groups in its neighbor. The process is called autophosphorylation because the receptors are of the same type. The phosphorylated tyrosine groups provide docking sites where relay proteins bind. They initiate a series of protein phosphorylations that lead to the response of the cell. Receptors with tyrosine kinase activity often bind hormones like insulin and other growth factors that affect cell growth and differentiation. To view the animation again, drag the hormone to the receptor. Click Continue to proceed. On this page, we will study mechanisms used by epinephrine and insulin to induce cellular responses. Nearly all body cells express receptors for epinephrine and norepinephrine called adrenergic receptors. There are two families of adrenergic receptors, alpha and beta, with each member of the family designated by a number. All adrenergic receptors bind both epinephrine and norepinephrine, although with different affinities. All adrenergic receptors activate G proteins. Beta receptors are coupled to adenylate cyclase by stimulatory G proteins that increase cyclic AMP activity. Alpha-2 receptors are coupled to adenylate cyclase by inhibitory G proteins that decrease cyclic AMP activity, often blocking the increases induced by other agents. Alpha-1 receptors act via the IP3-DAG and calcium second messenger system. Some cellular responses to these catecholamines are listed beneath the appropriate receptors. Blood flow is redirected to working muscles where increased cardiac output delivers increased fuel and oxygen. Fuel molecules are released from stores and made available for use by working muscles. The airways dilate to maximize gas exchange. Note that all of these effects support the fight or flight response. Insulin acts primarily on liver, adipose tissue, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle by binding to tyrosine kinase receptors. Each tissue responds differently, and each has multiple responses. Some of the cellular responses to insulin are listed beneath the receptors. Glucose uptake increases in all three major tissue types. Insulin stimulates glycogen synthesis in muscle and liver cells and triglyceride synthesis in adipose and liver cells. Amino acid uptake and protein synthesis are stimulated in muscle. Note that these effects support the overall goal of promoting storage of fuel molecules.
نتناول الصنف الثاني من الهرمونات اللي نسميها lipid soluble hormones، واللي هنا تشمل لنا الستيرويدز هرمونز والثايرويد اللي هو قلنا amine group bind the receptors typically located inside the cell. هذا الريسبتر ماله. each receptor هنا has two binding site. واحد site هنا bind to the hormone من جهة، والجهة الثانية site bind to the DNA. هسه راح نشوف هذه، راح نشوفها animation وتفهموها أحسن.
Steroids and thyroid hormone bind to receptors typically located inside cells. Most of these intracellular receptors are located in the nucleus. Each receptor has two binding sites. One site binds to the hormone, one site binds to DNA. In the absence of hormone, the receptor is bound to a chaperone protein that masks the DNA binding site and probably also acts to stabilize the protein. The receptors are not active until a hormone binds to them. Drag the hormone to the binding site on the receptor to observe its activity. A hormone binds to a receptor. The receptor changes shape. This activates the receptor and causes the chaperone to disassociate from it. If it is not already in the nucleus, the hormone receptor complex enters the nucleus. Hormone receptor complexes act as transcription factors. They bind to specific regions of DNA called hormone response elements. Typically, the binding results in activation of or turning on a particular gene. When a gene is activated, messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced and enters the cytosol where it is transcribed to form proteins. Typically, the proteins that are synthesized are enzymes that catalyze biochemical reactions and cause the response of the cell. The properties of transcription factors are far more complex than the description above. Transcription factors can regulate more than one gene, and they can also decrease or turn off the activity of genes. Transcription factors for different hormones can bind to the same hormone response elements, although each transcription factor activates a specific group of genes. To view the animation again, drag the hormone to the receptor. Click Continue to proceed. On this page, we will study the mechanisms used by cortisol and thyroid hormone to induce cellular responses. The action of cortisol follows the typical pattern for steroid hormones. It binds to glucocorticoid receptors that are present in nearly all cells. Some of the many cellular responses to cortisol are listed. Cortisol acts to maintain high levels of fuel molecules, maintain blood pressure, and modulate body defenses, all necessary for the stress response. We will study the stress response in Topic 5. The thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, enter cells by diffusion, and to some extent by carrier-mediated transport. Once inside, T4 is converted to T3, the active form of the hormone. Receptors for thyroid hormones differ from steroid hormone receptors. They are bound to the response elements of the DNA. T3 binds to the receptor, causing gene activation or eliminating the inhibition that was present, thus allowing genes to be expressed. Small amounts of T4 may also bind to the receptors. Receptors for thyroid hormones are also found in the cytosol and mitochondria, but their function is poorly understood. Nearly all body cells have thyroid hormone receptors and require thyroid hormone for normal function. Some of the many effects of thyroid hormone are listed. Thyroid hormone is the main regulator of metabolic rate in the body.